Using the large kafir corporations and companies as a front, the Freemasons channel the vast amounts of money to which they have access to finance the social projects, which ensure continued profits and therefore power for themselves, and which also ensure the continued subservience of the people who are caught up in working in those social projects. It is clear from this perspective that the kafir taxation system is in fact just one more kafir finance system, which ensures that people do not have too much money to play with, and are accordingly obliged to keep on working in the kafir producer-consumer process. Once the taxes have been collected and their overall bulk in effect is disguised by giving them different names, and by taxing not only earned income, but also any transaction where capital is gained or transferred, and where consumer items or services are purchased or utilize the money which has been accumulated in this way, can then be used to finance the social projects of the Freemasonic ruling elite's choice. Thus, for example, the Freemasonic-controlled government will give the juicy contract to the Freemasonic-controlled building corporation to build all the buildings needed to house all the activities of the bureaucratic infrastructure which is used by the government to gather retaxes which are needed to control the country which it rules. The argument which states that since the government has been elected by the people, therefore, it follows that the government policies are the policies which the people want and support, is nonsense. Firstly, the government which is publicly elected is not the real government. It is just a figurehead government, which distracts the attention of the people away from the real ruling elite who are the Freemasons. Secondly, the reality of the democratic election process today is that the figurehead government is always elected by a minority of the actual total number of people living in the kafir state in question, even though it has been elected by a majority of those who bothered to vote. The reason why so many people do not bother to vote is because they at least have an inkling of the fact that they have no real choice in the matter. They are presented with a limited choice of apparently acceptable candidates, usually not more than two, both of whom make promises which they usually never keep, and neither of whom necessarily represent the views of those who usually end up voting for them. Simply because there is no one else to vote for, people are encouraged to vote through the media system, on the basis that since it is their country, they should have a say in who rules it. But in fact, they can only choose someone who has his name on the ballot slip, and the only people who ever get their names on the ballot slip in the first place and get elected are people who either secretly or unwittingly support the activities of the Freemasonic ruling elite, and who in turn are supported by that elite. Since it is impossible to conduct a successful election campaign without the use and support of the media, all of which costs a great deal of money, either the people vote for, or even if they do not vote, which means that they do not wish to be governed by any of the candidates standing for election, the so-called government still gets elected, and the real ruling force behind the facade oft-election pantomime, that is the Freemasonic ruling elite, remains in power. Of course, some kafir states do not even bother with elections. Instead, the figurehead ruler claims to have the interests of the people at heart, and may even call the country a people's republic to prove it. Although, of course, this meaningless phrase changes nothing. The people who really rule the kafir states of today are the people who control the kafir finance and business institutions, that is, the Freemasons. The Freemasons decide what the social projects are to be. The Freemasonic-controlled business institutions carry out those social projects, enslaving the working population within those social projects in the process. The Freemasonic-controlled finance institutions finance these projects. The key kafir finance institution is the banking system, since it handles the lifeblood of the consumer-producer process, that is, money. The importance of the banking system lies in the fact that it not only facilitates financial transactions on a national level, but also enables transactions between different countries using different currencies to take place. As a result of these international transactions, money itself becomes a commodity. as well as making money by charging a commission every time one currency is changed into another currency. Money can also be made simply by buying and selling different currencies at strategic intervals. These transactions are very magical, since often no money actually changes hands. And yet, by buying and selling on the same day, a profit can be made and recorded in the bank computer's memory. This activity is very similar to what happens on the stock exchange, which is ostensibly the place where companies and corporations raise money to finance their operations. By promising to pay the shareholder a dividend, that is, interest on the money which he or she is effectively lending to the company. This method of raising money is attractive to the corporation or company, because it may work out cheaper than borrowing it from the bank. This method of lending money is attractive to the shareholder, because if the company or corporation makes large profits, then the annual return on the loan will probably be greater than the interest which would have accrued if free money loan had been deposited with the bank. What, in fact, happens is that the different shares, like the different currencies, become commodities in themselves. You can buy and sell them. You can buy and sell them for different reasons. You can buy and sell them to gain or relinquish control of the company or corporation whose shares they are. This works by virtue of the reasoning that if you are providing most of the finance for the company or corporation, then you should have the final say in how it is run. Naturally, the Freemasons have a controlling interest in all the important corporations, because only they have access to the funds which are necessary to acquire such an interest. This system of control by owning the bulk of the shares of any large business concern means that the Freemasons can take over virtually whoever they want, simply because they can provide whatever price is needed to achieve this object. Once they have a controlling share, they can then staff that company or corporation with their own people. This is one way in which the Dajjal takeover sometimes manifests. The usual reason for buying and selling shares is simply to make money by investing it wisely, or to raise money quickly if you need it. Another reason for buying and selling shares is to make a quick profit without actually having had to part with any money at any stage in the transaction. Like the gambling which goes on in the currency exchange, it all happens on paper or on the computer screen via the internet. One of the favorite techniques is to buy shares, even though you do not have the money to pay for them, hoping to sell them again at a higher price before the time for your having to pay for them falls due. Alternatively, you can sell shares which you do not possess, in the hope that you can buy them from someone else at a lower price than what you will be paid for them. And before the time arrives when you are meant to be handing them over to the person to whom you originally sold them before you had them. In using either of these techniques, it is possible to make a large profit from nothing other than skillful juggling along the telephone lines. Of course, if, like the Freemasons, you already have the capital at your disposal in the first place, then you can buy and sell shares at leisure, hoping that the market forces will eventually enable you to sell for more than you bought, or to buy for less than what you will eventually sell. It is on the commodity, stock and money exchanges that the power struggles for control of the kafir producer-consumer system, that is the Dajjal system, are conducted. It is from these power struggles that money is made. Thus, even at the very tip of the producer-consumer pyramid, the principle of divide and rule is applied. The main division is between those who control and those who are controlled. In financial terms, this is the difference between those who lend money and those who borrow money. Any large corporation in its infancy has to borrow money in order to grow. One of the ways in which this is done is to borrow money from one source, then to go to another source and borrow more money using the sum you have already borrowed as security for the second loan. Having in effect doubled your money on the strength of nothing, you then go to another source and borrow more money again, using the money you have accumulated thus far as security. This process can usually be repeated up to 8 times in succession by a corporation which is sufficiently large enough to command a good credit rating. Having amassed sufficient funds by this method, the corporation then has to embark on a business venture which will reap sufficient profits to pay back all the loans and the interest thereon. In order to do this, its controllers must be ruthless, and all the successful ones are. There comes a time when a successful corporation has generated enough activity and accrued sufficient capital not to have to borrow any more. At this stage, it can begin to take over other smaller corporations and companies, either by agreement or by sharp dealing on the stock exchange. There comes a point where a really large corporation has amassed enough capital in enough different countries to be able to have its own internal banking system, which works independently from, but not in competition with, the main international banking system. Lane effect: the multinational corporation bank is in a position to pursue all the profitable activities enjoyed by kafir banking as a whole, such as loaning money on interest and financing profitable projects for a price, whilst the corporation is released from the liabilities which it would incur if it still relied on the main kafir banking system, such as, for example, having to pay bank charges every time large sums of money are transferred from one country to another, or being subject to exchange control regulations, or having to pay interest on loans raised for new projects. By having their own banks, the multinational corporations ensure their freedom to act, since they and the main kafir banking system are not in competition with each other, because all the chief controllers concerned are Freemasons. The money which the large multinational corporations expend sooner or later finds its way into the main banking system, which can then make it grow by lending 12/13 of it at interest, or by investing that proportion profitably on the stock exchange. The main kafir banking system does not stop creating money out of nothing at this stage. First, the money which has been created by Karjan Jinterist can then be loaned out again, and thus accrue further interest. This process can continue ad infinitum. Secondly, the man who borrows £1,000, for example, will probably put some of it in the bank. Although row him, it is a minus amount, in the sense that it is not really is to spend, because he will eventually have to pay it back. To the bank it is a plus amount in the sense that 12/13 of what has been deposited can be loaned out again, or otherwise invested. This process can also continue ad infinitum. As far as small man in the street transactions are concerned, the aforementioned banking practices do not appear to be significant. Although, of course, when all the small transactions in the world are added together, it is clear that the banking system makes a considerable profit even out of these. Where these practices do become significant is in the large multinational transactions. Loans of several $1,000,000 or pounds accrue much interest in a short time. This means that the subservience of the debtor to the loaning bank is correspondingly greater. It also means that the pool of wealth, which the loaning bank accumulates by multiplying it through charging interest on what is in, increases at such a rate that in the end, it does not really matter whether or not a particular loan is repaid. No one in bank is going to starve if the loan is not repaid. What is important, however, is that the bank is in a position to dictate to the borrower the conditions on which the obligation to repay the interest or the loan, or both, will be waived. And it is in an even stronger position to lay down further conditions under which further sums will be loaned, such as, for example, in what projects the new loans must be invested. Lane effect: by creating the debt, the bank gains control over whoever has borrowed the money. The ultimate expression of the control through debt and motivation through fear syndromes is to be seen in the activities of the International Monetary Fund and of the World Bank. Basically, the IMF lends money to the so-called developed countries of the high-tech North, whilst the World Bank lends money to the countries of the Third World. That is, the so-called less developed countries of the poor South. These two financial institutions have so much money, on paper at any rate, or rather, in computer that it has no meaning as money purse. What it really means is control over every government in the world, because there is not a government in the world today which is not in debt. And once a government is in debt, it can then be told how to spend the money, which is subsequently lent to it. And it can be told that if it does this, then there will be more funds available. And it can be told that if it does that, then there will be no more funds available. This is the principal way in which the Freemasonic controlling elite of the kafir system, that is, the Dajjal system, attempt to control the world. The Freemasonic controlled banking system loans money to governments and continues to loan to them after they have become heavily indebted, and can never hope to repay all the money back, on the condition that they do as they are told. This is the reality of what is called neo-colonialism. Although it is said that the countries in question have been given their so-called independence, in fact, this has only been granted once the country in question has become totally involved in the kafir consumer-producer process, and totally reliant on the kafir banking system to finance that process. Most of the larger national debts in the non-Muslim countries were created and developed during the 18th and 19th centuries, while most of the national debts in the Muslim countries were created during the 20th century. Largely thanks to the efforts of Jamaluddin al-Afghani, Muhammad Abdu, and Rashid Reda, who, having been granted the dubious privilege of becoming members of Lord Cromer's Freemasonic Lodge. Lord Cromer was a member of the notorious Barings banking family, eventually managed to persuade the Muslim rulers of the day, more by means of bribery than the original teachings of Islam, that certain types of usury were not haram, and that it was not only halal but indeed preferable to use paper money, thereby facilitating the introduction of the utterly haram banking system into the Muslim lands, in the name of progress, development, and modernization. Since all national debts have been structured in such a way that they will never be repaid, even England's national debt, which was initiated with a £1.2 million loan to King William of Orange, was deliberately structured on the basis of irredeemable annuities, and since by the operation of compound interest combined